The title was Warden of Greyhallow. It sounded impressive if you did not know what Greyhallow was. Alpha King Alistair Vane knew exactly what it was. A crumbling fortress on the northern coast where wind and salt had been dismantling stone for 3 centuries. Where the last occupant had been a disgraced lord who drank himself to death in the East Tower, and where the nearest village was a fishing settlement of 47 people who had not seen a representative of the crown in 11 years. Greyhallow was the Vane dynasty's garbage drawer, the place where inconvenient things were sent to be forgotten. And Alistair, 3 days after their arranged wedding, sent his new wife there with a title that was technically a governance appointment and functionally an exile. Here is what he said, standing in his study with a document bearing the royal seal that assigned me to the most desolate posting in his territory. Greyhallow requires a warden. The position comes with full governance authority over the northern district. It is an important role. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the document, at the seal, at anything that was not the face of the woman he had married for an alliance with the Thorncroft mining interests and intended to manage at maximum distance. I understood. The marriage was a transaction, my family's mineral wealth for his military protection, and the transaction did not require proximity. He needed my name on the alliance papers. He did not need me in his palace. Greyhallow was the filing cabinet where he intended to store me. I could have refused. The Thorncroft family had enough political weight to challenge an exile disguised as an appointment. My mother, Lady Orla Thorncroft, would have burned the palace to its foundations if she knew what he was doing. Which is why I did not tell her. Because I looked at the assignment document and I saw something Alistair did not intend me to see. Not the insult, the opportunity. Full governance authority over the northern district. That meant I could do whatever I wanted with Greyhallow. Build, reform, restructure. The document gave me legal authority to reshape an entire region without requiring the king's approval for individual decisions. He had given me exile. He had also, accidentally, given me autonomy. And autonomy for a woman who had spent her life being managed by her family's expectations and her husband's indifference was worth more than any palace. I left for Greyhallow the following morning, packed my own trunks because the palace staff did not believe I was actually going. The assumption was that the new queen would negotiate, compromise, perform whatever concessions were necessary to remain at court where power was visible. I did not negotiate. I did not compromise. I loaded my belongings onto a cart, hired a driver from the palace stables, a young beta named Nils Eriksson who was the only staff member who volunteered for the journey north, and I drove away from the Vane Palace without looking back. Because looking back requires something worth seeing, and the man who had sent me to a ruin 3 days after our wedding was not, at that moment, worth the turn of my head. He gave her his coldest title and his emptiest castle 3 days after their wedding. She packed her trunks, hired one driver, and left without looking back. He expected her to rot in exile. She had other plans for his ruin. Chapter 1. Greyhallow was worse than the document suggested. The fortress sat on a cliff above the northern sea. Grey stone, grey sky, grey water stretching to a grey horizon. The roof of the main hall had partially collapsed. The east tower where the disgraced lord had died was structurally unsound. The stables held no horses. The kitchen held no food. The grounds held nothing except wind-bent grass and the particular desolation of a place that had been abandoned so thoroughly that even the ghosts had moved on. Nils stood beside the cart, surveyed the ruin, and said with admirable understatement, "It needs work." I stood on the cliff edge and felt the wind hit my face with the full force of the northern sea, and I laughed. Not bitterly, genuinely, because the wind was clean. The air tasted like salt and freedom and the absence of palace politics. The sky was enormous, bigger than any sky I had seen, unbounded by towers and walls and the suffocating architecture of a court that had never wanted me. And the ruin, for all its devastation, was mine. Not borrowed, not conditional, not contingent on my performance as a queen. Mine. The Warden of Greyhallow. The title he had given me as a punishment. The title I was going to make mean something. My name is Briar Thorncroft. I was 30 years old, Omega, and I had spent my entire life being underestimated by men who confused quiet competence with passive compliance. I was the eldest daughter of a mining family. I had grown up watching my mother manage the Thorncroft operations with an efficiency that kept 500 miners employed in 3 districts economically viable. I knew how to build things, not metaphorically. Literally, I could read architectural plans, calculate structural loads, evaluate material costs, and manage construction crews because my mother believed that a woman who understood infrastructure would never be dependent on a man who did not. Alistair Vane had sent me to a crumbling castle. He did not know he had sent a builder to a building site. The village of Greyhallow was the first priority. 47 people living in the fishing settlement at the base of the cliff, surviving on catch and stubbornness and the kind of community resilience that develops in places the government has forgotten. I walked into the village on my second morning, introduced myself as the new warden, and asked what they needed. The silence that followed was the silence of people who had never been asked. Then a woman named Dagny Rask, the village's informal leader, a weathered fisherwoman with hands like rope and eyes that assessed my worth in 3 seconds, said, "Everything. We need everything." So I sat with Dagny and the village elders in a fisherman's cottage that smelled like brine and wood smoke, and we made a list. The list was long. The resources were minimal. But the governance document Alistair had signed gave me authority to allocate Northern District funds, and the Northern District funds, neglected, unspent, accumulating for 11 years of absent governance, were substantial. The king had sent me to a ruin with a budget he had forgotten existed. I intended to spend every coin of it. He sent a builder to a building site and did not know it. She walked into a forgotten village, asked what they needed, and heard the answer. Everything. The king had forgotten the budget. She had not. The ruin was about to become the most surprising thing in his kingdom. Chapter 2. I rebuilt Greyhallow in 18 months. Not alone, the 47 villagers, once they understood that the new warden was serious and the budget was real, became the workforce, the brain trust, and the heart of the project. Dagny Rask managed the fishing operations and the coastal infrastructure. Her husband Per, a retired shipwright, oversaw the structural repairs to the fortress. Tomas Herrera, Niels Eriksson's cousin, a carpenter who traveled north when he heard work was available, became the master builder. Dr. Anika Strand, a physician who had been trying to establish a practice in the underserved northern region, set up a clinic in the fortress's restored west wing. Within 6 months, Greyhallow had a functioning medical facility, the first in the Northern District's history. The fortress itself was the visible transformation, but the infrastructure was the real achievement. I rebuilt the road connecting Greyhallow to the nearest trade route, opening the village to commerce for the first time in a decade. I established a fish processing facility that allowed the villagers to sell preserved catch to southern markets, instead of consuming it all locally. I negotiated a supply agreement with my own family's mining operations. Yes, I used the Thorncroft connection. Autonomy does not require isolation. That brought building materials north at cost. I opened a school, hired teachers, built a community hall where the village gathered for meals and meetings, and the particular social cohesion that transforms a settlement into a community. The population grew. Word spread through the northern territories that Greyhallow, the ruin, the dumping ground, the place where inconvenient things were sent to be forgotten, had become something unexpected. A thriving community with employment, medical care, education, and a warden who knew every resident's name and asked about their children, and stood on the cliff every morning watching the sea as if the view were payment enough for the work. By month 12, the population had tripled. By month 18, Greyhallow was the most economically productive district in the Northern Territory, a fact that appeared in the vain treasury reports that landed on the king's desk alongside the tax revenues that were, quietly, significantly, reshaping his kingdom's financial landscape from a direction he had never expected. I made the fortress a home, not a palace, a home. The distinction was architectural and philosophical. Palaces are designed to impress. Homes are designed to shelter. I rebuilt Greyhallow's main hall with an open hearth that heated the entire ground floor. A long table where anyone, villager, traveler, visiting merchant, could sit and eat, and windows that faced the sea because the view was the fortress's greatest asset, and I refused to waste it on walls. I filled the rooms with furniture built by Per's workshop. Sturdy, handcrafted, made from local wood that smelled like the forest and felt like being held. I planted a garden inside the fortress walls, herbs, vegetables, flowers that had no business surviving the northern wind, but that grew anyway because I was stubborn and the soil was better than anyone expected. The home I built was not beautiful by palace standards. It was warm, and warmth, I was learning, was the only standard that mattered. 18 months, a crumbling ruin became a thriving community. Population tripled. First medical clinic in the district's history. A school, a processing facility, a road that opened an isolated village to the world. And the fortress became what no vain palace had ever been. A home. Warm, open, smelling of wood smoke and the sea. Chapter 3. Alistair came to Greyhallow 20 months after sending me there. Not because he missed me, because his treasury reports told him something impossible was happening in the north. The district he had written off as a wasteland was generating revenue that exceeded 3 of his southern provinces combined. The population growth was attracting attention from neighboring territories. Foreign delegations were requesting visits to Greyhallow, the castle he had sent his wife to as an exile, because its governance model was being discussed in continental policy circles as an example of regional development innovation. His wife, the woman he had filed away in a ruin, was becoming famous, and he was becoming the king who had sent her there, which was either visionary or foolish depending on how the story was told. He arrived on horseback with a small escort, having refused the full military delegation his council recommended, because, he told Commander Brennan, this was personal. He came over the ridge that overlooked the northern coast and saw Greyhallow for the first time since his own childhood visit 20 years ago. And he stopped, because the ruin he remembered, the gray, collapsed, salt-eaten skeleton of a fortress, was gone. In its place was a living thing. Smoke rose from a chimney. Light glowed in windows. A road he had never seen wound down the cliff to a village that was 4 times the size he expected, with boats in the harbor and carts on the road and the visible bustling energy of a community that was functioning. I was in the garden when he arrived, kneeling in the dirt, planting winter herbs, wearing a work dress and muddy boots, and none of the royal regalia that a queen was technically required to maintain. Niels, who had become my right hand and my early warning system, ran from the gate. "The king is here." I wiped my hands on my apron, took off the gardening gloves, did not change clothes, did not arrange my hair, did not perform any of the preparations that the palace would have expected for a royal visit. I met my husband at the gate of the castle he had sent me to as an exile, wearing dirt on my knees and herbs in my hands, and I said, "Welcome to Greyhallow, Your Majesty. Would you like tea, or would you prefer to see the accounts first?" He stared at me, then at the fortress behind me, the repaired walls, the lit windows, the garden growing inside battlements that had been empty for a century, then at the village below, the boats, the roads, the medical clinic visible from the cliff. He looked like a man who had opened a drawer expecting dust and found a diamond. "You did this," he said. It was not a question. "The governance document gave me full authority," I said. "I used it." He walked past me into the fortress. I let him go. Let him see what I had built without narrating it, because the building spoke for itself more eloquently than I could. He walked through the main hall with its open hearth and long table, through the medical clinic where Dr. Strand was treating a fisherman's infected hand, through the school where 16 children were learning arithmetic from a teacher I had recruited from the capital, through the kitchen where Dagny's daughter Sigrid was preparing the evening meal for anyone who showed up, because the Greyhallow table was open and had been since the day I arrived. He found me in the garden afterward, sat on the bench I had built from driftwood, built myself, with my own hands, because building things with your own hands is how you make them yours. The silence between us was vast and specific, containing 20 months of absence and the particular awkwardness of a man sitting in the garden of a home his wife built inside the exile he assigned her. "I sent you here to get rid of you," he said. "I know," I said. "And you built—" He gestured at everything. "This, yes." "Why?" He seemed genuinely baffled, not by the construction but by the motivation. "Why would you build something in a place designed to diminish you?" "Because the place did not diminish me," I said. "You did. The place was just stone and wind. What I did with it was my choice. And I chose to build because building is what I do. It is what my mother taught me. It is who I am. You sent me to a ruin. I sent myself to a building site. The ruin is your story about me. The building site is mine." He came expecting the ruin he remembered, found a home he did not recognize, walked through every room, the clinic, the school, the open kitchen, the garden growing inside battlements. Then he sat on a driftwood bench and said, "I sent you here to get rid of you." She said, "I know. The ruin is your story about me. The building site is mine." I did not invite him to stay, he simply did not leave, which was a different thing. He slept in one of the guest rooms I had furnished for visiting merchants because I did not offer the room I slept in, and he did not ask. He ate at the long table with the villagers and the fishermen and the children and the traveling traders, which was clearly the most disorienting experience of his life. A king eating fish stew beside a woman who mended nets for a living, served by a teenager who called him Sir instead of Your Majesty, because Greyhallow did not stand on ceremony and Sigrid did not know or care about royal protocol. Over 7 days I watched something happen to Alistair Vane that I had not expected and did not trust. He softened. The rigid, controlled, emotionally fortified king who had dismissed me 3 days after our wedding began to, there is no other word, thaw. He asked Dagny about the fishing operations and listened, genuinely listened, to a woman whose expertise he would have ignored at court. He sat in the school and watched the children learn with an expression that I recognized as longing. The specific longing of a man who had been raised in a palace designed for governance and had never seen a room designed for growing. He walked the cliff path every morning, breathing the salt air with the desperate inhalation of a man who had been suffocating somewhere warm and had not known it until he found somewhere cold that let him breathe. On the 5th evening, sitting by the hearth after the village had dispersed, he said, "My palace has 300 rooms and none of them feel like this." Like what? I asked. Like someone lives in them, they are decorated, furnished, maintained by 40 staff members. But no one has sat by a fire in the main hall since my mother died. No one eats at the dining table except during formal functions. The corridors are clean and silent, and they smell like nothing because a palace that smells like something would be considered beneath the Vane standard. I live in a monument. You built a home. He looked at me across the hearthlight. I do not know how to build homes, he said. I know how to build monuments. My father taught me that grandeur is governance, and governance is distance, and distance is strength. I have been distant my entire life, and I am very strong, and I am... He stopped. I waited. The fire cracked. He said, I am so lonely, Briar. I have 300 rooms, and I am lonelier than anyone I have ever met. And I sent you away because having a wife in the palace would have required me to be present, and being present would have required me to be human. And being human is the one thing the Vane dynasty never taught me how to do. I did not rush to comfort him, did not cross the distance between our chairs to offer the warmth he was clearly starving for, not out of cruelty, out of the hard-won understanding that a man who sent his wife to a ruin 3 days after their wedding does not get comforted on his timeline. He gets comforted on hers. You sent me to a ruin, I said. You gave me a title designed to humiliate and a castle designed to break me. And when neither of those things worked, when I built something instead of dissolving, you came here. Not because you missed me, because the treasury reports told you I was succeeding. That is not loneliness, Alistair. That is accounting. I watched him absorb the distinction. He nodded slowly. You are right. I came because the numbers surprised me. I stayed because the home surprised me. And I am sitting here now because the woman who built all of this from a ruin was the woman I sent away, and the fact that I sent her away is the single worst decision I have ever made. Not politically. Personally. I sent away the person who builds homes because I was afraid of living in one. 300 rooms, and none of them felt alive. He came for the treasury reports. He stayed for the hearth. And he told the woman he exiled that he sent her away because living in a home required being human, and being human was the thing he had never learned. She did not rush to comfort him. Comfort, she had decided, would happen on her timeline, not his. Chapter 5. My conditions were structural, non-emotional negotiations, architectural ones. If Alistair wanted a place in the life I had built, he would build alongside me. Literally. I handed him a hammer and assigned him to Purr's crew repairing the East Tower, the tower where the disgraced lord had died, which I was converting into a library. He had never held a hammer. He held it wrong for 3 days. Purr, who did not care about royal dignity, corrected his grip with the blunt instruction of a craftsman who valued straight nails over straight titles. Nils kept account of Alistair's misstrikes, which reached 47 on the first day alone. The king of the Vane territories spent his first week at Greyhallow with blisters on his palms and sawdust in his hair, building a library in a tower that had housed nothing but failure for 30 years, and he did not complain once. Not because he was performing humility, because the work was doing something to him that the palace never had. It was making him useful, not powerful, useful, and useful for a man who had confused power with purpose his entire life was a revelation. He returned to the capital after 2 weeks, left with something he had not brought. A reason to come back. He came back monthly, then bi-weekly, then every week, riding north on Fridays, arriving at Greyhallow by evening, spending the weekends in the fortress he had meant as a punishment and that had become the only place where he functioned as a human rather than a title. He worked on the construction crews, ate at the long table, learned to fish, badly, under Dagny's ruthless instruction, played chess with the village children who did not let him win because Greyhallow did not produce sycophants, and 7-year-olds are constitutionally incapable of false deference. The romance grew from the building, not beside it, not despite it, from it, from the shared labor of repairing a wall in the rain because the wall would not repair itself during good weather, from the arguments about structural priorities that we conducted with the passionate specificity of 2 people who cared deeply about load-bearing walls. From the evening he put his hand over mine on the long table, casually, as if the gesture were as natural as passing bread, and I let it stay because the hand that had signed my exile had also spent 3 months learning to hold a hammer, and the learning mattered more than the signing. He proposed at Greyhallow, in the garden, on the driftwood bench where he had first sat, and said, "I sent you here to get rid of you." He did not bring a ring. He brought a stone, a piece of Greyhallow granite that he had cut from the cliff face himself, badly, unevenly, with the amateur determination of a man who had learned that building things with your own hands is how you make them yours. "I want to marry you again," he said. "Not the alliance, not the arrangement. You, the woman who took a ruin and made it home. I want to marry you and I want to live here, not the palace. Here, where the table is open and the fire is lit, and the children beat me at chess and Dagny yells at me about fishing technique. Here, where I learn to hold a hammer and build walls and be useful instead of powerful. Here, where you turned my worst decision into the best place I have ever been." I took the stone, held it in hands that had been building for 20 months, hands that had carried lumber and planted gardens and repaired roofs and kneaded bread for a long table where anyone could sit. "Yes, and I built a home. Yes, and now you want to live in it. More than I have ever wanted anything." I looked at the stone, rough, imperfect, cut by a man who had never used a chisel before this year. I looked at the sea beyond the cliff, and the village below, and the fortress that had been a ruin when I arrived and was now the warmest place in the kingdom. "The ruin was your story about me," I said. "But this, the home, this is mine. If you want to live in it, you live in it as a resident, not a ruler. You eat at the long table. You work with Purr's crew. You lose at chess gracefully. You learn to fish. And you remember, every day, that the woman who built this place was the woman you threw away. Not because I need you to feel guilty. Because I need you to understand what you almost missed." He pressed the stone into my hands. "I understand," he said. "I almost missed everything." Epilogue. 3 years later, our daughter was born at Greyhallow during a storm so fierce that the midwife had to be brought from the village by boat, because the cliff path was impassable. We named her Dagny, after the fisherwoman who had been the first person to trust me, because names should carry the weight of the people who shaped you, and Dagny Rask had shaped Greyhallow as surely as any architect. Baby Dagny had Alistair's dark hair and my stubbornness, and a cry that Purr said could be heard from the harbor, which he considered a compliment to her lung capacity and her potential as a future crew leader. Alistair governed from Greyhallow 3 weeks of every month. The Vane Palace remained the administrative capital. Some functions required the traditional infrastructure, but the king conducted the majority of his governance from a fortress on a northern cliff, with salt air in the corridors and a 7-year-old chess opponent. Who showed no mercy? The palace staff were bewildered, the court was scandalized, and the kingdom was thriving, because a king who governs from a home makes different decisions than a king who governs from a monument. Better decisions, warmer ones, decisions that consider the 47 people in a fishing village as carefully as the 400 in a palace. One evening, Alistair sat at the long table after the village had eaten, and the fire was settling into embers, and baby Dagny was asleep in the cradle that Purr had carved from driftwood. The fortress was quiet, the particular quiet of a full house resting, different from the hollow silence of empty palaces. He looked at the hall, the repaired roof, the open hearth, the table that seated 30 and had, on its busiest night, seated 62. "I gave you a ruin," he said. "You built a kingdom," I corrected. He shook his head. "I built a kingdom. Monuments and distance in 300 empty rooms. You built a home. And the home is better. The home is where people actually live." He looked at me across the table that I had built and he had helped repair and where their daughter slept in a driftwood cradle. "I spent my whole life building things designed to impress," he said. "You built the only thing that matters. A place where people come back to. Not because they have to. Because they want to." I reached across the table and took his hand. The hand with the hammer calluses, the hand that had learned to build walls and cut stone and lose at chess to 7-year-olds. "You came back," I said. He squeezed my hand. "To the best thing I ever gave away," he said. And the fire settled, and the sea sounded against the cliff, and the home that had been a ruin held them all, the builder, the king, the sleeping child, inside walls that had been cold and were now, permanently, irreversibly warm. The Alpha King gave her his coldest title and his emptiest castle. She made it a home. He came back to it, not because the treasury reports told him to, because the home she built from his exile was the only place in his kingdom where the fire was real. The table was open, and the man behind the crown was allowed to be human. He gave her a ruin. She gave him everything he did not know he was missing.